Good day to all. Before we begin our presentation, I would like to introduce the members of JDP Co. JDP Co consists of Keith Bartido, Gio Cipriano, Alessandro Cruz, Jan De La Paz, and me, Justin Gonzalez, the project manager. The special project assigned to us by ITRMO for our capstone project is Security Audit Tool Evaluation and Proof of Concept Development Projects, with our program manager, Mr. Patrick Medina. I will be giving a brief background and overview of what the project is all about in the next set of slides through the explanation of the project charter. Let's start with the overview of the project by briefly going through what is contained within the project charter. The Security Audit Tool Evaluation and Proof of Concept Development Projects was assigned to us by the ITRMO, or Information Technology Resource Management Office, to propose at least one open source security audit tool and one commercial security audit tool. The purpose of this project is to provide ITRMO with several options for standardizing their security vulnerability testing processes for their different web-based applications and systems. The project aims to use the chosen SAT tools of at least one open source SAT software and at least one commercial SAT software demo to test the security and check the vulnerabilities of a web system or web application under a specific Loyola Schools office, which will be then assigned to our group by the ITRMO. This enables ITRMO to assess their vulnerabilities and prevent data breaches of web-based systems that houses sensitive information. The deliverables for this project shall include a proof of concept for the proposed security audit tools, which includes one open source SAT software and one commercial SAT software demo, documentation and training manuals of chosen open source SAT software and commercial SAT software demo for existing and new team members of ITRMO, documentation of the vulnerability testing done with the chosen open source SAT software and commercial SAT software demo within the specified testing windows, validation of test runs of chosen open source SAT software and commercial SAT software demos, and analysis and reports on the results of the testing process of chosen open source SAT software and commercial SAT software demo. Now, the SAT tools will be selected based on meeting the following objectives: software preferences of the ITRMO, compliance with OWASP, or Open Web Application Security Project and Data Privacy Act of 2012, and agreed upon price range. Now, these deliverables that were previously mentioned will help AGRU improve their security of web-based applications. To achieve this goal, the project will also undergo the following steps: communication with the ITRMO to establish software preferences, the recommendation of open source and commercial SAT software options to ITRMO, analysis of the options based on software functionalities, and compliance with the OWASP checklist and the Data Privacy Act of 2012, vulnerability testing done with the chosen software options, validation of test runs, analysis of results, and generation of reports. However, the group will not include the continuous maintenance and implementation of SATs within the Loyola schools, buying commercial SAT software. The group will only use demos of these commercial SATs for testing. The group will also strictly follow agreed upon set of testing rubrics and test cases. And lastly, JDP Co shall not be held accountable for any unforeseen damages and security exploitations of the assigned web-based applications and systems within the project timeframe. Now, here is the initial timetable of major deliverables and milestones. The planning phase, which ends on November 6, 2020, information gathering, which ends on December 14, 2020, risk and change management, which ends on December 30, 2020, planning and analysis of options, which ends on January 29, 2021, procurement of SAT software demos, which ends on January 29, 2021 as well. Security Audit Tools Compatibility Check, which ends on February 26, 2021. Vulnerability Test, which ends on March 31, 2021. Testing Analysis and Report, which ends on April 30, 2021. Stakeholders Approval, which ends on May 7, 2021. And lastly, Project Closure, which ends on May 7, 2021 as well. Now, this initial timetable is subject to change throughout the project. And the last part of the project charter, the budget. There is no budget allotted for the Automated Security Audit Tools project. The stakeholders will not allot budget for the project, and thus, JDP Co will only create recommendations and evaluations of SAT tools for the project. JDP Co will not procure commercial SAT software licenses for ITRMO, but instead procure commercial SAT software demos to be used for the vulnerability testing of web applications to avoid incurring costs. ITRMO will then receive JDP Co's assessment and final report on the recommended and evaluated SATs once the project finishes. JDP Co will leave it to ITRMO's discretion to purchase a commercial SAT for continuous implementation within Loyola schools, which is no longer within the scope of the project.
So for the WBS, we begin with the planning phase. This involves the project scope, diagrams and matrices, which involves the work breakdown structure, RACI matrix, and the Gantt chart. This also includes the project timetable and the budget. The person accountable for this is Justin, and each group member is responsible for each task. Next is the information gathering phase. In this phase, we research on OWASP-based SATs, both open source and commercial softwares. Then we made a list of these softwares. This includes details about the software and hardware requirements and the functionalities of the SATs. People who are both accountable and responsible for this is both me and Appa. I handle the open source part and he handles the commercial part. Then, the risk and change management phase. Here we made the risk register, which involves the risks that our project may face. In this register, we analyze the risks, its description, root cause and triggers, probability and impact, and our group's potential response. We also made the change management system, which allows us and our stakeholders to submit and record any changes that will be proposed after the initial phases. The person accountable for these is Justin, and the whole group is responsible for this phase. After that is the planning and analysis of options. This focuses on creating our group's criteria, on choosing the SATs, and our coordination with our stakeholders, that is ITRMO. This will help us in narrowing down and finalizing the listed SATs to be tested. For the criteria, both me and Appa are accountable and responsible. As for the coordination with ITRMO, Justin is both accountable and responsible. Following this is the procurement of the softwares. There's no problem in getting a copy of the open source SATs, but for the commercial ones, we have to contact the sellers and inquire about their software's demo. In this way, we don't have to subscribe or buy the software for the testing phase. The person accountable for this is Justin, and the people who are responsible for this is, again, Justin, Appa, and me.
For phase 6 of the project, which is a compatibility check for the SATs we've picked, for the web applications of the client, we will be doing a brief compatibility evaluation between the SAT and the web app through the application of the rubric that we'll make with the guidance of the ITRMO. The evaluation for the open source SATs and the commercial SATs will be based on their respective rubrics. The ones responsible and accountable for this phase is me, Gio Cipriano, as well as Keith Bartido. On to the next phase. Phase 7 consists of the testing plan, which are the test cases that we will be executing during the testing phase and the actual pen test. This phase also includes the making of the manuals for each commercial and open source SAT on how to operate them for ITRMO's use and future reference. Management oversight will also be included to account for anything that the group has missed prior to testing. We also plan to coordinate with ITRMO throughout this phase to make sure that our manuals, test plans, and test cases are sufficient for the purpose of the project. Testing will be done in coordination with ITRMO and the client after all previous tasks have been finished. Keith Bartido is responsible for the testing plan, Gio Cipriano for the manuals and test cases, and finally Justine Gonzalez for the management oversight and coordination with IT RMO. After testing, Phase 8 will be analysis and making the reports. It will include a possible series of retestings if ITRMO is not satisfied with the group's initial findings. Web application vulnerability assessment consists of analyzing the reports from the SATs to find out the effectiveness of the SAT itself. The SWOT analysis will consist of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis of the chosen SATs as well as the web application of the client. All of these will be included in the final report for the project. Keith Bartido is responsible for validation testing and SWOT, G. Cipriano for web app vulnerability assessment, and while all of us in the group will be working on the final report, for formality purposes, the responsibility will be put under Justine Gonzalez. Finally, Phase 9 and 10 will involve approval of the report and all the deliverables from stakeholders, such as ITRMO and the client, and this will also indicate the start of project closure. So moving on to the Gantt chart, here we can see that the project started late October but was delayed a month and a half due to the typhoon. Our group resumed work starting December 7 with the info gathering phase. Up to this week, the first week of January, working on a risk register and change management system. Creating a rubric for our SATs will happen during the month of January, and from the middle of January to early February, we will be doing the procurement of our SAT demos, our compatibility checks, as well as doing our testing plan for the actual pen test. On the other hand, the penetration testing will start on the second week of February all the way to the last week of March, giving us about a month to work on scheduling problems and concerns, and to give ample time to the pen testing. The rest of April will then be allotted for the final analysis and reports, the stakeholders' approvals, as well as the project closure, which will happen in the first week of May.
At this part of the video, I will be talking about the risk management of our project. For our risk management, we have created a risk register, but I won't go too much into detail on all the risks here. However, I will be focusing on 4 out of 18 risks because due to the video limit restrictions, we chose the 4 most relevant risks throughout the project. There are other risks that are also important, but the first 2 are the ones that we are trying to mitigate as we begin finalizing the shortlist of SATs and procuring the demos needed for these, while the last 2 risks are the risks that we feared the most because it is during the testing phase of our project. So I will be breaking down the 4 risks in this part of our video by describing what the risk is, its root cause and trigger, our chosen potential response, and the qualitative analysis. We use the qualitative analysis to analyze the risks that we thought of, so we use the formula of probability times impact to determine the rank of the risk. For our first risk, we have R2. It is the risk of the vendors not responding. We decided that the risk was a medium probability because we cannot assume that all vendors will respond, so it is safer to assume that half will at least respond. The root cause of this risk are that the vendors are just not responding to our attempts to contact them. The trigger to this risk is if the vendor has not responded to our emails in at least a week, and if they still do not respond another week after the follow-up email, and so on and so forth. For our response to this risk, we believe it is best to accept this risk. Though continuous communication with the vendor is also viable, it is better to move ahead with the information posted in the website as we wait for their response. We labeled this as a high impact risk because due to the vendors not responding, we lessen our choices in picking an SAT to present. We don't know if the vendors that did not reply have a better application than the ones we have information on. Or, in the worst case scenario, if no vendor replied, then we will have almost no information regarding the SATs, thus giving an inaccurate presentation. For our second risk, we have R4. It is named the demos of the finalized shortlist for the SATs are not procured. In order for us to give a better analysis and presentation, we would like to procure the demos of the SATs to give a better understanding as to why we chose them, Plus, it gives the stakeholders a better idea on what they will be expecting. However, there will be some cases that the vendor will not allow us to receive the demos, which is also the root cause of the risk. The trigger of the risk is when the vendors do not give us a demo for whatever reason. Our response is to mitigate this risk. We will ask ITRMO for a letter of authorization so that we may procure the demos on our own. If all else fails, we will opt for the free trial. We decided that this is a medium probability risk because we had an inclination that some vendors would not be responsive, and because of that we wouldn't be able to receive the demos for their application. This is a high impact because if we are not able to receive any demos for any of our chosen vendors, we cannot give an accurate and detailed presentation. For our third risk, we have R15. It is the risk of possible external attacks in the form of hacking during the testing phase. One of our tests will conduct a shields down test, and that means that we will test without any protection. This allows us to see what vulnerabilities can appear in the web application. However, it also means that it is vulnerable to external factors such as getting hacked. The root cause of this risk are the hackers, people eyeing the sensitive data being managed by ITRMO. The trigger will be seeing reports regarding hacking or cyber attacks on other universities or schools. Our response is to transfer this risk. The group is not capable of handling this kind of problem, so it is best for us to simply notify ITRMO as soon as possible, so that they can handle it accordingly. We labeled the probability of this risk to be medium, because we do not really know if it will happen, and we have no idea if someone or a group of people will hack into ITRMO's web applications. And though there have been no recent attacks, it is still a risk to consider. It is a high impact risk because if their web application is hacked, then that means the information they are housing is now vulnerable. For our last risk, we have R17. It is the risk of the SATs breaking the web application during the testing phase. What we mean by this risk is that what if using the SAT breaks the UI or the front end of the application because of the incompatibility? The root cause of this risk are the faulty SATs that we procured, but also the negligent research done on our part. A trigger is that the web application's UI breaks or the website crashes during the penetration tests. Our chosen response is to eliminate this risk. We believe that we should go through proper analysis and coordination with ITRMO to create a rubric for picking an SAT that really fits with what ITRMO wants, and that is compatible with what they have. We labeled this as a medium probability because we believe that the commercial SATs will be fine, however we cannot assume the same with the open source tools. The impact of course being high because even if the tool is good, if it is incompatible with ITRMO's web applications, that ultimately affects our choice in the long run. Next, I will talk about the standard operating protocol for monitoring the risks. Risk monitoring and reassessment are done every group meeting. This happens after every approved change request as well. If a risk occurs, our first step is to check and update the risk register. You must first update the status of the risk that has occurred. If it is not there, then it is inputted in the risk register. Second, assessment of the risk that occurred and deliberation of risk response plans. If the preferred risk response plan and other potential risk response plans are no longer viable, the group discusses possible risk response plans to solve the risk. Third, the group chooses a risk response plan that will be executed to address the occurring risk. If the response affects the timeline and project, it must go through the change management plan. Then the stakeholders are notified via email. If it does not affect the two, then the stakeholders are just informed of the response. Fourth, risk execution. If the risk response affects the project timeline, it will be executed if all stakeholders approve. If it is rejected, the group then holds an emergency meeting and negotiates with the stakeholders on what needs to be done. Then we must go back to step 2. If the risk response does not affect the project timeline, then it is just executed immediately. Lastly, we have the reassessment of the risk register. And that is our standard operating protocol for monitoring risks.
Now with regards to change management, to properly track and manage change requests, we will be using the following 4-step process. Change request submission will happen through the use of Google Forms. Users can submit requests through a form that will be distributed to the stakeholders, and these submissions will automatically be encoded to a change management log via a Google Sheet. This change management log can be accessed by JDP corporations and the stakeholders involved. Access to sections pertaining to stakeholders will be restricted and limited to the respective stakeholder. Change request monitoring will take place in the change management log. The log contains data that will be used by the stakeholders in their decision to approve the change request, as well as tracking the approval status of each request. Change request review will have the group and stakeholders involved review the change requests in the change management log by analyzing data that will decide the approval of the request, such as priority, justification, efforts required, and project impact. Lastly, change request status will depend on the review and deliberation of the group and involve stakeholders and their decided action on the change. The status of the change request could be tagged as accepted, in review, or rejected. Google Forms was chosen for two reasons: ease of submission and its integration with Google Sheets. Using Google Forms will streamline the change request process by connecting submission forms directly to the Google Sheets and automatically encoding every entry to a Google Sheet file. Going back to change request submission process, the first part of the submission form will request details from the request owner regarding the submission of the change request. Included here are the request owner's name, position, and email address for contact purposes. The second part of the submission form will request details regarding the change request itself. Included here are a detailed description of the problem and the circumstances that led to the requested change, detailed description of the change requested, the priority level assigned to the change, supporting information that could help in understanding the request, and finally reasons why the change was requested and should be implemented. Now for the change management log. Aside from the data submitted from the form, there will be sections for data important to the change request monitoring and review, such as date that the request was acted on, which part of the project is impacted by the change, like deliverables, timeline, or budget, alternatives that have been considered, technical changes required to implement the change, impact of the change on the project, which stakeholders are involved, the approval status for each of the stakeholders, and lastly, the status of the request itself. These sections aren't in the form and will be accessed only through the log. The summary of our cost estimations for the project are as follows. First, we based the average salary per hour for each of the roles from payscale.com's average salary per hour for project managers, information security analysts, and business analysts in the Philippines. These are the ones highlighted in a red box. Second, albeit the total work hours of the activities in the work breakdown structure is 179 hours, when we take into account the task assignments of each group member, the total work hours required for the project is 403 hours, with an estimated total cost of 97,170.54 pesos. This accumulation is split among the group, with the project manager taking up 83 hours of work, with an average salary of 206.3 pesos per hour, and a total cost of 17,122.90 pesos. Both information security analysts take up 83 hours of work each, with an average salary of 285.54 pesos per hour, and a total cost of 23,699.82 pesos for each of the person in the role. Business Analyst 1 take up 80 hours of work, with an average salary of 212 pesos per hour, and a total of 16,960 pesos. And Business Analyst 2 take up 74 hours of work, with an average salary of 212 pesos per hour, as well as a total of 15,688 pesos.
We learned that proper planning is important because it helps in managing our project, tasks, and whatever we want to do. And it also gives structure which helps our project succeed. But there's no guarantee that the initial plans will always work. That is why we need to know the risks that our project might encounter so that we can make a backup plan. With this, we are able to adapt to urgent situations and we can become flexible.
Links to the different documents used in this video are in the description below.
And that concludes our presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.